So many great matchups in college football this weekend, like 12 or 13 games that are just captivating. I think 7 games involving top 25 teams. So this one might be a little under the national radar, but Maryland hosting Ohio State, big for both programs, especially Maryland, big for the Big Ten, to see what Maryland may have to offer in the conference this season. We bring in Pete Volk of Testudo Times. He's also the deputy college football editor for SB Nation. Pete, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Good to be back.
Definitely. You definitely provided some great stuff in the past concerning the Terps. We've long awaited entry into the Big Ten. It got off to a great start with a big win at Indiana. The Hoosiers coming off the Mizzou win, and people thought that might be a close game, and not so much. This Maryland team's been pretty impressive in regards to going to Syracuse, winning by 25 points, and then the Indiana victory. And a bad first half against West Virginia. Otherwise, you got to be happy with this Maryland performance so far.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were expecting a 4-1 start. There was some hope for maybe a 5-0 start just because all the teams that were on Maryland's schedule were beatable, at least the first 5 games. But that 3-game stretch of West Virginia, Syracuse, Indiana, they're all solid teams. You kind of figured that Maryland wasn't really at the point yet where they're going to beat every solid team that they play. West Virginia in particular, to me, has really impressed. Clint Trickett and Kevin White have looked like a very good combination, and they hung with Alabama. They hung with Oklahoma for a bit as well. They've looked quite good. So for Maryland, they've had a very impressive start to the season. It's been a very long time since they've been able to comfortably beat Power 5 teams on the road. My colleague Andrew Emmer was looking up after the Syracuse game. The last time that Maryland beat a Power 5 non-conference opponent on the road, and he looked all the way back to 1992 and did not find one. So this is new territory for Maryland. It's not very familiar for Maryland fans to be playing like this, and they're playing quite well.
I think the Big Ten itself has embraced Maryland and Rutgers' entry into the conference, but at the same time, I think you've gotten the vibe from a lot of Big Ten football-based people that they've stuck their nose up in the air to a certain extent, not thinking that Maryland or Rutgers were going to bring anything to the conference, and that still remains to be seen over the long haul. But that first showing was really good, and I would expect Maryland's going to give Ohio State a decent game here. Let's dive into the one reason why this could be a really good football game, and that would be Ohio State's issue in the secondary. Just seems to not go away. They are not fixing it. Urban Meyer continues to say that they're looking at it. They hired a new defensive backs coach. This goes all the way to last season, despite a really good football team, legit top 10 team. They couldn't stop people through the air, anybody through the air. And Maryland has the speed on the outside to do the same thing Cincinnati did last week and burning them for like 3 70-plus yard touchdown passes and more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Maryland has a phenomenal wide receiving core. It might be the best in the Big Ten. Stefon Diggs and Deion Long were both blue-chip prospects coming out of high school. They both had tremendous games against Indiana. That was kind of the difference. It was Mike Loxley's play calling against Indiana and Syracuse as well was much better than the first few weeks. Before that, opponents were able to stop Diggs and Long just by focusing on them, and then other players like Marcus Leak, another wide receiver who's very good for Maryland, was able to get into the action. But last week against Indiana, both Stefon Diggs and Deion Long had over 100 yards receiving, and Maryland needs to continue to target those guys, especially, as you pointed out, Ohio State's weaknesses in the secondary. If you can get those kind of playmakers in space, they're going to make big plays against the Buckeyes.
Yeah, and it's a head-scratcher for Ohio State supporters because you would think, you just mentioned what Maryland did against Indiana, you would think, oh, Ohio State's got a bunch of 4- and 5-star recruits back there. It's not going to happen, but it continues to happen against whoever they play. And again, it was Gunnar Kiel in Cincinnati last week. On the other hand, the Buckeyes, very formidable up front on defense, maybe the best defensive line in the country. And your thoughts about Maryland matching up there?
Yeah, as I talked to you before we started recording, it's an interesting matchup just because it has each team's biggest weakness against each team's biggest strength. Ohio State's secondary going up against Maryland's wide receivers, but it's also Ohio State's defensive line going up what has been a pretty weak Maryland offensive line. They played much better against Indiana, particularly on the left side with left tackle Michael Dunn and left guard Silvano Altamirano. But on the right side, they struggled a lot against West Virginia, and that's kind of been a growing concern for Maryland throughout the season. They're going to have to really work hard to stop Joey Bosa, who's one of the most dominating defensive linemen in the country. He could make big plays against Maryland in this game, and they're going to have to scheme around him and figure out how they're going to get the ball away before he gets to the quarterback.
All right, Pete, the trigger man from Maryland, that's still in question between Caleb Rowe and C.J. Brown. So do you have any indication of who may be under center?
I imagine it's going to be C.J. Brown. Brown is the starter. It's just a question of whether he's healthy. He suffered an injury against Indiana. He sprained his left wrist. He's a right-handed quarterback, so I imagine he can play with a sprained left wrist, but we don't know. I think Caleb Rowe provides a better matchup maybe for Ohio State, but Brown is a more experienced quarterback. He's more comfortable in Maryland's offense. If it were me, I would try and utilize both just because Caleb Rowe has a much greater ability to throw the ball downfield, which would, as we pointed out, be very useful against this Ohio State secondary. C.J. Brown is more of a running-based quarterback. He can make shorter throws, but on the deep ball, he sometimes struggles, although he has connected on a few in his Maryland career. I imagine C.J. Brown's going to start. You might see some of Caleb Rowe, but we'll have to wait until Saturday. Randy Etzel's given no clear indication so far.
And otherwise on the field, Maryland a little beat up, so can you kind of assess where the injury status is for this football team?
Yeah, especially it's been on the defensive side of the ball. Maryland's linebacking core has been injured a lot throughout the season. In that loss against West Virginia, they at one point, I believe through the last 2 quarters of the game, none of their 4 starting linebackers, who were all seniors, were able to play. All were injured. They've had injuries throughout that linebacking core, and that particularly hurts them defending against the short passing game. Matt Robinson, a senior linebacker, outside linebacker, he's a converted safety, and he does a very good job of stopping tight ends, running backs, slot receivers over the middle. And so without him, they kind of struggle against those kind of intermediate routes, especially now that Alvin Hill, one of Maryland's starting cornerbacks, is out for the season.
Not necessarily speaking to what's going on right now in college football, because the Big Ten, I think it's not really an argument at this point down. At the same time, bounced back a couple weeks ago, helped by Maryland in beating the ACC 3 straight games. The ACC, considered a basketball conference, again, the Big Ten, traditionally a football powerhouse. Your thoughts about Ohio State coming to Maryland and then the Terps going on the road at some point and playing in 100,000-seat stadiums for the first time?
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, the buzz around campus has been something unlike I have seen in years. You know, Maryland had a big game last year against Florida State. That obviously didn't work out too well. The Seminoles beat the number 25 Maryland 63-0. But this is Maryland's first kind of marquee home game in quite some time. There was a few years ago under Ralph Friedgen, Maryland had a big home game against Florida State. But even still, you know, Florida State has had a lot of success over the years. But the tradition of that program doesn't really compare to the tradition of Ohio State, to the tradition of Michigan, to some of these older Big Ten programs who have been around and have been dominating for decades and decades and decades. And so Maryland's first Big Ten road game was at Indiana, not quite that same environment, but I'm excited to see what happens when they go and play Michigan later this year, when they go and play Wisconsin on the road, when they go and play Penn State. Those are games that are going to be big litmus tests for the program, how they're going to do against, especially with Michigan and Penn State, teams that look very beatable right now in hostile environments.
All right, Pete Volk of Testudo Times, the Maryland platform on SB Nation, and also Deputy College Football Editor for SB Nation college football in general. So, Pete, thanks so much for the information and the insight. You're welcome anytime. We love it.
Thank you very much, Mark.